The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace-Wells. Chapter 1. Cascades. It is worse, much worse than you think. The slowness of climate change is a fairy tale, perhaps as pernicious as the one that says it isn't happening at all, and comes to us bundled with several others in an anthology of comforting delusions that global warming is an Arctic saga unfolding remotely, that it is strictly a matter of sea level and coastlines, not an enveloping crisis sparing no place and leaving no life undeformed, that it is a crisis of the natural world, not the human one, that those two are distinct, and that we live today somehow outside or beyond, or at the very least defended against nature, not inescapably within and literally overwhelmed by it, that wealth can be a shield against the ravages of warming, that the burning of fossil fuels is the price of continued economic growth. That growth and the technology it produces will allow us to engineer our way out of environmental disaster. That there is any analog to the scale or scope of this threat in a long span of human history that might give us confidence in staring it down. None of this is true, but let's begin with the speed of change. The Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions before the one we are living through now, each so complete a wiping of the fossil record that it functioned as an evolutionary reset. The planet's phylogenetic tree first expanding, then collapsing at intervals like a lung. 86% of all species dead 450 million years ago. 70 million years later, 75%. 125 million years later, 96%. 50 million years later, 80%. 135 million years after that, 75% again. Unless you are a teenager, you probably read in your high school textbooks that these extinctions were the results of asteroids. In fact, all but the one that killed the dinosaurs involved climate change produced by greenhouse gas. The most notorious was 250 million years ago. It began when carbon dioxide warmed the planet by 5 degrees Celsius, accelerated when that warming triggered the release of methane, another greenhouse gas, and ended with all but a sliver of life on Earth dead. We are currently adding carbon to the atmosphere at a considerably faster rate, by most estimates at least 10 times faster. The rate is 100 times faster than at any point in the human history before the beginning of industrialization. And there is already, right now, fully a third more carbon in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, perhaps in as long as 15 million years. There were no humans then. The oceans were more than 100 feet higher. Many perceive global warming as a sort of moral and economic debt, accumulated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and now come due after several centuries. In fact, more than half of the carbon exhaled into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels has been emitted in just the past 3 decades, which means we have done as much damage to the fate of the planet and its ability to sustain human life and civilization since Al Gore published his first book on climate than in all the centuries, all the millennia that came before. The United Nations established its climate change framework in 1992, advertising scientific consensus unmistakably to the world. This means we have now engineered as much ruin knowingly as we ever managed in ignorance. Global warming may seem like a distended morality tale playing out over several centuries and inflicting a kind of old treatment retributing on a great-great-grandchildren of those responsible. Since it was carbon burning in 18th century England that lit the fuse of everything that has followed. But that is a fable about historical villainy that acquits those of us alive today and unfairly. The majority of the burning has come since the premiere of Seinfeld. Since the end of World War II, the figure is about 85%. The story of the industrial world's kamikaze mission is the story of a single lifeline. The planet brought from seeming stability to the blink of catastrophe in the years between a baptism or bar mitzvah and a funeral. We all know those lifetimes. When my father was born in 1938, among his first memories, the news of Pearl Harbor and the mythic air force of the industrial propaganda films that followed. The climate system appeared, to the most human observers, steady. Scientists had understood the greenhouse effect, had understood the way carbon produced by burnt wood and coal and oil could hothouse the planet and disequilibrate everything on it for 3/4 of a century. But they had not yet seen the impact, not really, not yet, which made warming seem less like an observed fact than a dark prophecy, to be fulfilled only in a very distant future, perhaps never. By the time my father died, in 2016, weeks after the desperate signing of the Paris Agreement, the climate system was tipping towards devastation, passing the threshold of carbon concentration, 400 parts per million in the Earth's atmosphere. In the eerily banal language of climatology that had been, for years, the bright red line environmental scientists had drawn in the rampaging face of modern industry, saying, "Do not cross." Of course, we kept going. Just 2 years later, we hit a monthly average of 411, and guilt saturates the planet's air as much as carbon, though we choose to believe we do not breathe it. The single lifetime is also the lifetime of my mother. Born in 1945 to German Jews, fleeing the smokestacks through which their relatives were incinerated, and now enjoying her 73rd year in an American commodity paradise, a paradise supported by the factories of a developing world that has, in the space of a single lifetime too, manufactured its way into the global middle class with all the consumer enticements and fossil fuel privileges that come with that ascent: electricity, private cars, air travel, red meat. She has been smoking for 58 of those years, unfiltered, ordering the cigarettes now by the carton from China. It is also the lifetime of many of the scientists who first raised public alarm about climate change, some of whom incredibly remain working. This is how rapidly we have arrived at this promontory. Roger Revelle, who first heralded the heating of the planet, died in 1991. But Wallace Smith Broker, who helped popularize the term global warming, still drives to work at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory across the Hudson every day from the Upper West Side, sometimes picking up lunch at an old Jersey filling station recently outfitted as a hipster eatery. In the 1970s, he did his research with funding from Exxon, a company now the target of a raft of lawsuits that aim to adjudicate responsibility for the rolling emissions regime that today, bearing a change of course on fossil fuels, threatens to make parts of the planet more or less unlivable for the humans by the end of this century. That is the course we are speeding so blithely along, to more than 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100. According to some estimates, that would mean that whole regions of Africa and Australia and the United States, parts of South America, north of Patagonia, and Asia south of Siberia would be rendered uninhabitable by direct heat, desertification, and flooding. Certainly, it would make them inhospitable, and many more reasons besides. This is our itinerary, our baseline, which means that if the planet was brought to the brink of climate catastrophe within the lifetime of a single generation, the responsibility to avoid it belongs with a single generation too. We all also know that second lifetime, it is ours. I am not an environmentalist and don't even think of myself as a nature person. I have lived my whole life in cities, enjoying gadgets built by industrial supply chains I hardly think twice about. I have never gone camping, not willingly anyway. And while I always thought it was basically a good idea to keep streams clean and air clear, I also always accepted the proposition that there was a trade-off between economic growth and cost to nature, and figured, well, in most cases, I would probably go for growth. I am not about to personally slaughter a cow to eat a hamburger. but I'm also not about to go vegan. I tend to think when you are at the top of the food chain, it's okay to flaunt it, because I don't see anything complicated about drawing a moral boundary between us and other animals. And in fact, find it offensive to women and people of color that all of a sudden there is a talk of extending human rights like legal protections to chimps, apes, and octopus, just a generation or two after we finally broke the white male monopoly on legal personhood. In these ways, many of them, at least, I am like every other American who has spent their life fatally complacent and willfully deluded about climate change, which is not just the biggest threat human life on the planet has ever faced, but a threat of an entirely different category and scale. That is, the scale of human life itself. A few years ago, I began collecting stories of climate change, many of them terrifying, gripping, uncanny narratives, even with the most small-scale sagas playing like fables. A group of Arctic scientists trapped when melting ice isolated their research center on an island populated also by a group of polar bears. A Russian boy killed by anthrax released from a thawing reindeer carcass, which had been trapped in permafrost for many decades. At first, it seemed the news was inventing a new genre of allegory. But of course, climate change is not an allegory. Beginning in 2011, about 1 million Syrian refugees were unleashed on Europe by a civil war, inflamed by climate change and drought. And in a very real sense, much of the populist moment the entire West is passing through now is the result of panic produced by the shock of those migrants. The likely flooding of Bangladesh threatens to create 10 times as many or more received by a world that will be even further destabilized by climate chaos, and one suspects less receptive the browner those in need. And then there will be the refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the rest of South Asia, 140 million by 2050, the World Bank estimates, meaning more than 100 times Europe's Syrian crisis. The UN projections are bleaker, 200 million climate refugees by 2050. 200 million was the entire world population at the peak of the Roman Empire. If you can imagine every single person alive and living anywhere on the planet at the time dispossessed of their home and turned outward to wander through hostile territories in search of a new one. The high end of what's possible in the next 30 years, the United Nations says, is considerably worse. 1 billion or more vulnerable poor people with little choice but to fight or flee. 1 billion or more. That was the entire global population as recently as 1820, with the Industrial Revolution well underway, which suggests that we might better conceive of history not as a deliberate procession of years marching forward on a timeline, but as an expanding balloon of population growth, humanity dilating across the planet almost to the point of full eclipse. One reason carbon emissions have accelerated so much in the last generation is also an explanation for why history seems to be proceeding so much faster, with so much more happening everywhere, every year, and even every day. This is what results when there are simply that many more humans around. 15% of all human experience throughout the history, it's been estimated, belongs to people alive right now, each walking the earth with carbon footprints. Those refugee figures are high-end estimates, produced years ago by research groups designed to call attention to a particular cause or crusade. The true numbers will almost surely fall short of them, and scientists tend to trust projections in the tens of millions rather than the hundreds of millions. But that those bigger numbers are only the far upper reaches of what is possible should not lull us into complacency. When we dismiss the worst-case possibilities, it distorts our sense of likelier outcomes. We then regard as extreme scenarios we need not plan so conscientiously for. High-end estimates establish the boundaries of what's possible, between which we can better conceive of what is likely. Perhaps they will prove better guides even than that, considering the optimists have never, in the half-century of climate anxiety we have already endured, been right. My file of stories grew daily, but very few of the clips, even those drawn from new research published in the most pedigreed scientific journals, seemed to appear in the coverage about climate change the country watched on television and read in its newspaper. In those places, climate change was reported, of course, and even with those tints of alarm. But the discussion of possible effects was misleadingly narrow, limited almost invariably to the matter of sea level rise. Just as worrisome, the coverage was sanguine, all things considered. As recently as the 1997 signing of the landmark Kyoto Protocol, 2 degrees Celsius of global warming was considered the threshold of catastrophe. Flooded cities, crippling droughts and heat waves, a planet battered daily by hurricanes and monsoons we used to call natural disasters, but will soon normalize as simply bad weather. More recently, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands offered another name for the level of warming: genocide. There is almost no chance we will avoid the scenario. The Kyoto Protocol achieved practically nothing. In the 20 years since, despite all of our climate advocacy and legislation and progress on green energy, we have produced more emissions than in the last 20 years before. In 2016, the Paris Accords established 2 degrees as a global goal, and to read our newspapers, the level of warming remains something like the scariest scenarios it is responsible to consider. Just a few years later, with no single industrial nation on track to meet its Paris commitment, 2 degrees look more like a base case outcome, at present hard to credit, with an entire bell curve of more horrific possibilities extending beyond it and yet shrouded delicately from public view. For those telling stories about climate, such horrific possibilities, and the fact that we had squandered our chance of landing anywhere on the better half of the curve, had become somehow unseemly to consider. Reasons are almost too many to count, and so half-formed they might better be called impulses. We chose not to discuss a world warmed beyond 2 degrees out of decency, perhaps our simple fear, or fear of fear-mongering, or technocratic faith, which is really market faith, or deference to partisan debates, or even partisan priorities, or skepticism about the environmental left of the kind I had always had, or disinterest in the fates of distant ecosystems like I had also always had. We felt confusion about the science and its many technical terms and hard-to-pass numbers. We suffered from slowness apprehending the speed of change, or semi-conspiratorial confidence in the responsibility of global elites and their institutions, or obeisance towards those elites and their institutions, whatever we thought of them. Perhaps we felt unable to really trust scarier projections because we had only just heard about warming, we thought, and things couldn't possibly have gotten that much worse just since the first inconvenient truth, or because we liked driving our cars and eating our beef and living as we did in every other way and didn't want to think too hard about that, or because we felt so post-industrial that we couldn't believe we were still drawing materials breeds from fossil fuels furnaces. Perhaps it was because we were so sociopathically good at collating bad news into a sickening, evolving sense of what constituted normal, or because we looked outside and things seemed still okay, or because we were bored with writing or reading the same story again and again. Because climate was so global and therefore non-tribal, it suggested only the corniest politics. Because we did not yet appreciate how fully it would ravage our lives. And because, selfishly, we did not mind destroying the planet for others living elsewhere on it, or those not yet born who would inherit it from us, outraged. Because we had too much faith in the teleological shape of history and the arrow of human progress to countenance the idea that the arc of history would bend toward anything but environmental justice too. Because when we were being really honest with ourselves, we really thought of the world as a zero-sum resource competition, and believed that whatever happened, we were probably going to continue to be the victors, relatively speaking anyway. Advantages of class being what they are, and our own luck in the natalist lottery being what it was. Perhaps we were too panicked about our own jobs and industries to fret about the future of jobs and industry. Or perhaps we were also really afraid of robots, or were too busy looking at our new phones. Or perhaps, however easy we found the apocalypse reflects in our culture and the path of panic in our politics, we truly had a good news bias when it came to the big picture. Or really, who knows why? There are so many aspects to the climate kaleidoscope that transforms our institution about environmental devastation into an uncanny complacency that it can be hard to pull the whole picture of climate distortion into focus. But we simply wouldn't, or couldn't, or anyway, didn't look squarely in the face of the science. This is not a book about the science of warming. It is about what warming means to the way we live on this planet. But what does that science say? It is complicated research because it is built on two layers of uncertainty: what humans will do, mostly in terms of emitting greenhouse gases, and how the climate will respond, both through straightforward heating and a variety of more complicated and sometimes contradictory feedback loops. But even shaded by those uncertainty bars, it is also very clear research, in fact, terrifyingly clear. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, offers the gold standard assessment of the state of the planet and the likely trajectory for climate change, gold standard, in part because it is conservative, integrating only new research that passes the threshold of inarguability. A new report is expected in 2022. But the most recent one says that if we take action on emissions soon, instituting immediately all of the commitments made in the Paris Accords but nowhere yet actually implemented, we are likely to get about 3.2 degrees of warming, or about 3 times as much warming as the planet has seen since the beginning of industrialization, bringing the unthinkable collapse of the planet's ice sheets not just into the realm of the real but into the present. That would eventually flood not just Miami and Dhaka, but Shanghai and Hong Kong and 100 other cities around the world. The tipping point for that collapse is said to be around 2 degrees, according to several recent studies. Even a rapid cessation of carbon emissions could bring us that amount of warming by the end of the century. The assaults of climate change do not end at 2100, just because most modeling by convention sunsets at that point. This is why some studying global warming call the 100 years to follow the century of hell. Climate change is fast, much faster than it seems we have the capacity to recognize and acknowledge. But it is also long, almost longer than we can truly imagine. In reading about warming, you will often come across analogies from the planetary record. The last time the planet was this much warmer, the logic runs, sea levels were here. These conditions are not coincidences. The sea level was there largely because the planet was that much warmer, and the geologic record is the best model we have for understanding the very complicated climate system and gauging just how much damage will come from turning up the temperature by 2 or 4 or 6 degrees. Which is why it is especially concerning that recent research into the deep history of planets suggests that our current climate models may be underestimating the amount of warming we are due for in 2100 by as much as half. In other words, temperatures could rise ultimately by as much as double what the IPCC predicts. Hit our Paris emissions targets and we may still get 4 degrees of warming, meaning a green Sahara and the planet's tropical forest transformed into fire-dominated savanna. The authors of one recent paper suggested the warming could be more dramatic still. Slashing our emissions could still bring us to 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, a scenario they said would pose severe risk to the habitability of the entire planet. Hothouse Earth, they called it. Because these numbers are so small, we tend to trivialize the differences between them. 1, 2, 4, 5. Human experience and memory offer no good analogy for how we should think of these thresholds. But as with world wars or recurrences of cancer, you don't want to see even one. At 2 degrees, the ice sheets will begin their collapse. 400 million more people will suffer from water scarcity. Major cities in the equatorial band of the planet will become unlivable, and even in the northern latitudes, heat waves will kill thousands each summer. There would be 32 times as many extreme heat waves in India, and each would last 5 times as long, exposing 93 times more people. This is our best case scenario. At 3 degrees, southern Europe would be in permanent drought, and the average drought in Central America would last 19 months longer, and in the Caribbean, 21 months longer. In northern Africa, the figure is 60 months longer, that is 5 years. The areas burned each year by wildfires would double in the Mediterranean and sextuple or more in the United States. At 4 degrees, there would be 8 million more cases of dengue fever each year in Latin America alone, and close to annual global food crisis. There could be 9% more heat-related deaths. Damages from river flooding would grow 30-fold in Bangladesh, 20-fold in India, and as much as 60-fold in the United Kingdom. In certain places, 6 climate-driven natural disasters could strike simultaneously, and globally, damages could pass $600 trillion, more than twice the wealth as exists in the world today. Conflict and warfare could double. Even if we pull the planet up short of 2 degrees by 2100, we will be left with an atmosphere that contains 500 parts per million of carbon, perhaps more. The last time that was the case, 16 million years ago, the planet was not 2 degrees warmer, it was somewhere between 5 and 8, giving the planet about 130 feet of sea level rise, enough to draw a new American coastline as far west as I-95. Some of these processes take thousands of years to unfold, but they are also irreversible, and therefore effectively permanent. You might hope to simply reverse climate change. You can't. It will outrun all of us. This is part of what makes climate change what the theorist Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject, a conceptual fact so large and complex that, like the internet, it can never be properly comprehended. There are many features of climate change, its size, its scope, its brutality, that alone satisfy this definition. Together, they might elevate it into a higher and more incomprehensible conceptual category yet. But time is perhaps the most mind-bending feature. The worst outcomes arriving so long from now that we reflexively discount their reality. Yet those outcomes promise to mock us and our own sense of the real in return. The ecological dramas we have unleashed through our land use and by burning fossil fuels slowly for about a century and very rapidly for only a few decades will play out over many millennia. In fact, over a longer span of time than humans have even been around, performed in part by creatures and environments we do not yet even know, ushered onto the world stage by the force of warming. And so, in a convenient cognitive bargain, we have chosen to consider climate change only as it will present itself this century. By 2100, the United Nations says we are due for about 4.5 degrees of warming, following the path we are on today. This is farther from the Paris track. Then the Paris track is from the 2 degrees threshold of catastrophe, which is more than doubles. As Naomi Orozco has noted, there are too many uncertainties in our models to take their predictions as gospel. Just running these models many times, as Gernot Wagner and Martin Weisman do in their book Climate Shock, yields an 11% chance we overshoot 6 degrees. Recent work by the Nobel laureate William Nordhaus suggests that better than anticipated economic growth means better than 1 in 3 odds that our emissions will exceed the UN's worst-case business-as-usual scenario. In other words, a temperature rise of 5 degrees or possibly more. The upper end of the probability curve puts forward by the UN to estimate the end of the century business-as-usual scenario, the worst-case outcome of a worst-case emissions path, puts us at 8 degrees. At that temperature, humans at the equator and in the tropics would not be able to move around outside without dying. In that world, 8 degrees warmer, direct heat effects would be the least of it. The oceans would eventually swell 200 feet higher, flooding what are now 2/3 of the world's major cities. Hardly any land on the planet would be capable of effectively producing any kind of food we eat now. Forests would be roiled by rolling storms of fire, and coasts would be punished by more and more intense hurricanes. The suffocating hood of tropical disease would reach northward to enclose parts of what we call now the Arctic. Probably about a third of the planet would be made unlivable by direct heat. And what are today literally unprecedented and intolerable drought and heat waves would be the quotidian condition of whatever human life was able to endure. We will almost certainly avoid 8 degrees of warming. In fact, several recent papers have suggested the climate is actually less sensitive to emissions than we had thought, and that even the upper bound of a business as usual path would bring us to about 5 degrees, with a likely destination around 4. But 5 degrees is nearly as unthinkable as 8, and 4 degrees not much better. The world in a permanent food deficit, the Alps as arid as the Atlas Mountains. Between that scenario and the world we live in now lies only the open question of human response. Some amount of further warming is already baked in, thanks to the protracted process by which the planet adapts to greenhouse gas. But all of those paths projected from the present to 2 degrees, to 3, to 4, 5, or even 8 will be carved overwhelmingly by what we choose to do now. There is nothing stopping us from 4 degrees other than our own will to change course, which we have yet to display. Because the planet is as big as it is and as ecologically diverse, because humans have proven themselves an adaptable species and will likely continue to adapt to outmaneuver a lethal threat, and because the devastating effects of warming will soon become too extreme to ignore or deny, if they haven't already, because of all that, it is unlikely that climate change will render the planet truly uninhabitable. But if we do nothing about carbon emissions, if the next 30 years of industrial activity trace the same arc upward as the last 30 years have, whole regions will become unlivable by any standard we have today as soon as the end of this century. A few years ago, E.O. Wilson proposed a term, half-Earth, to help us think through how we might adapt to the pressures of a changing climate, letting nature run its rehabilitative course on half the planet and sequestering humanity in the remaining, habitable half of the world. The fraction may be smaller than that, possibly considerably, and not by choice. The subtitle of his book was Our Planet's Fight for Life. On longer time scales, the even bleaker outcome is possible to the livable planet darkening as it approaches a human dusk. It would make a spectacular coincidence of bad choices and bad luck to make that kind of zero Earth possible within our lifetime. But the fact that we have brought that nightmare eventuality into play at all is perhaps the overwhelming cultural and historical fact of the modern era. What historians of the future will likely study about us, and what we would have hoped the generation before us would have had the foresight to focus on too. Whatever we do to stop warming, and however aggressively we act to protect ourselves from its ravages, we will have pulled the devastation of human life on Earth into view, close enough that we can see clearly what it would look like and know with some degree of precision how it will punish our children and grandchildren. Close enough, in fact, that we are already beginning to feel its effects ourselves when we do not turn away. It is almost hard to believe just how much has happened and how quickly. In the late summer of 2017, 3 major hurricanes arose in the Atlantic at once, proceeding at first along the same route as though they were battalions of an army on the march. Hurricane Harvey, when it struck Houston, delivered such epic rainfall it was described in some areas as a 500,000-year event, meaning that we should expect that amount of rain to hit that area once every 500 millennia. Sophisticated consumers of environmental news have already learned how meaningless climate change has rendered such terms, which were meant to describe storms that had a 1 in 500,000 chance of striking in any given year. But the figures do help in this way, to remind us how far global warming has already taken us from any natural disaster benchmark our grandparents would have recognized. To dwell on the more common 500-year figure just for a moment, it would mean a storm that struck once during the entire history of the Roman Empire. 500 years ago, there were no English settlements across the Atlantic. So we were talking about a storm that should hit just once as Europeans arrived and established colonies. As colonists fought a revolution and Americans a civil war and the 2 world wars. As their descendants established an empire of cotton on the backs of slaves, freed them, and then brutalized their descendants, industrialized and post-industrialized, triumphed in the Cold War. Ushered in the end of history and witnessed just a decade later its dramatic return. One storm in all that time is what the meteorological record has taught us to expect. Just one. Harvey was the third such flood to hit Houston since 2015. And the storm struck in places with an intensity that was supposed to be 1,000 times rarer still. That same season, an Atlantic hurricane hit Ireland. 45 million were flooded from their homes in South Asia, and unprecedented wildfires tilled much of California into ash. And then there was the new category of quotidian nightmare, climate change inventing the once unimaginable category of obscure natural disasters. Crises so large they would once have been inscribed in folklore for centuries today passing across our horizons, ignored, overlooked, or forgotten. In 2016, a 1,000-year flood drowned small town Ellicott City, Maryland. To take but one example almost at random, it was followed 2 years later in the same small town by another. 1 week that summer of 2018, dozens of places all over the world were hit with record heat waves. From Denver to Burlington to Ottawa, from Glasgow to Shannon to Belfast, from Tbilisi in Georgia and Yerevan in Armenia to whole swaths of southern Russia. The previous month, the daytime temperature of one city in Oman reached above 121 degrees Fahrenheit and did not drop below 108 all night. And in Quebec, Canada, 54 died from the heat. The same week, 100 major wildfires burned in the American West, including one in California that grew 4,000 acres in one day, and another in Colorado that produced a volcano-like 300-foot eruption of flames, swallowing an entire subdivision and inventing a new term, fire tsunami, along the way. On the other side of the planet, biblical rains flooded Japan, where 1.2 million were evacuated from their homes. Later that summer, Typhoon Mangkhut forced the evacuation of 2.45 million from mainland China. The same week, Hurricane Florence struck the Californias, turning the port city of Wilmington briefly into an island and flooding large parts of the state with hog manure and coal ash. Along the way, the winds of Florence produced dozens of tornadoes across the region. The previous month in India, the state of Kerala was hit with its worst floods in almost 100 years. That October, a hurricane in the Pacific wiped Hawaii's East Island entirely off the map. And in November, which was traditionally marked the beginning of the rainy season in California, the state was hit instead with the deadliest fire in its history, the Camp Fire, which scorched several hundred square miles outside of Chico, killing dozens and leaving many more missing in a place called proverbially paradise. The devastation was so complete you could almost forget the Woolsey fire closer to Los Angeles, which burned at the same time and forced the sudden evacuation of 170,000. It is tempting to look at these strings of disasters and think climate change is here. And one response to seeing things long predicted actually come to pass is to feel that we have settled in a new era with everything transformed. In fact, that is how California Governor J.D. Brown described the state of things in the midst of the state's wildfire disaster, a new normal. The truth is actually much scarier. That is, the end of normal, never normal again. We have actually exited the state of environmental conditions that allowed the human animal to evolve in the first place, in an unsure and unplanned bet on just what that animal can endure. The climate system that raised us and raised everything we now know as human culture and civilization is now like a parent, dead. And the climate system we have been observing for the last several years, the one that has battered the planet again and again, is not our bleak future in the preview. It would be more precise to say that it is a product of our recent climate past, already passing behind us into a dustbin of environmental nostalgia. There is no longer any such thing as a natural disaster, but not only will things get worse, technically speaking, they have already gotten worse. Even if miraculously humans immediately ceased emitting carbon, we would still be due for some additional warming from just the stuff we have put into the air already. And of course, with global emissions still increasing, we are very far from zeroing out on carbon, and therefore very far from stalling climate change. The devastation we are now seeing all around us is a beyond best case scenario for the future of warming and all the climate disasters it will bring. What that means is that we have not at all arrived at a new equilibrium. It is more like we have taken one step out on the plank of a pirate ship. Perhaps because of the exhausting false debate about whether climate change is real, too many of us have developed a misleading impression that its effects are binary. But global warming is not yes or no, nor it is today's weather forever or doomsday tomorrow. It is a function that gets worse over time as long as we continue to produce greenhouse gas. And so the experience of life in a climate transformed by human activity is not just a matter of stepping from one stable ecosystem into another, somewhat worse one, no matter how degraded or destructive the transformed climate is. The effects will grow and build as the climate continues to warm, from 1 degree to 1.5 to almost certainly 2 degrees and beyond. The past few years of climate disasters may look like about as much as the climate can take. In fact, we are only just entering our new brave world, one that collapses below us as soon as we set foot on it. Many of these new disasters arrived accompanied by debate about their cause, about how much of what they have done to us comes from what we have done to the planet. For those hoping to better understand precisely how a monstrous hurricane arises out of a placid ocean, these inquiries are worthwhile. But for all practical purposes, the debate yields no real meaning or insight. A particular hurricane may owe 40% of its force to anthropogenic global warming, the evolving models might suggest, and a particular drought may be half again as bad as it might have been in the 17th century. But climate change is not a discrete clue we can find at the scene of a local crime. One hurricane, one heat wave, one famine, one war. Global warming isn't a perpetrator. It's a conspiracy. We all live within climate and within all the changes we have produced in it, which includes us all and everything we do. If the hurricanes of a certain force are now 5 times as likely as in the pre-Columbian Caribbean, it is parsimonious to the point of triviality to argue over whether this one or that one was climate-caused. All hurricanes now unfold in the weather systems we have rigged on their behalf, which is why there are more of them and why they are stronger. The same is true for wildfires. This one or that one may be caused by a cookout or a downed power line, but each is burning faster, bigger and longer because of global warming, which gives no reprieve to fire season. Climate change isn't something happening here or there, but everywhere and all at once. And unless we choose to halt it, it will never stop. Over the past few decades, the term Anthropocene has climbed out of academic discourse and into the popular imagination, a name given to the geologic era we live in now, and a way to signal that it is a new era, defined on the wall chart of deep history by human intervention. One problem with the term is that it implies a conquest of nature, even echoing the biblical dominion. But however sanguine you might be about the proposition that we have already ravaged the natural world, which we surely have, it is another thing entirely to consider the possibility that we have only provoked it, engineering first in ignorance and then in denial a climate system that will now go to war with us for many centuries, perhaps until it destroys us. That is what Wally Broker, the avuncular oceanographer, means when he calls the planet an angry beast. You could also go with war machine. Each day we arm it more. The assaults will not be discreet. This is another climate delusion. Instead, they will produce a new kind of cascading violence, waterfalls and avalanches of devastation. The planet pummeled again and again with increasing intensity and in ways that build on each other and undermine our ability to respond, uprooting much of the landscape we have taken for granted for centuries as the stable foundation on which we walk, build homes and highways, shepherd our children through schools and into adulthood under the promise of safety, and subverting the promise that the world we have engineered and built for ourselves out of nature will also protect us against it, rather than conspiring with disaster against its makers. Consider those California wildfires. In March 2018, Santa Barbara County issued mandatory evacuation orders for those living in Montecito, Goleta, Santa Barbara, Summerland, and Carpinteria, where the previous December's fires had hit hardest. It was the fourth evacuation order precipitated by a climate event in the county in just 3 months, but only the first had been for fire. The others were for the mudslides ushered into possibility by that fire. One of the toniest communities in the most glamorous state of the world's preeminently powerful country, upended by fear that their toy vineyards and Harvey stables, their world-class beaches and lavishly funded public schools would be inundated by rivers of mud. The community as truly ravaged as the sprawling camps of temporary sects housing Rohingya refugees from Myanmar in the monsoon region of Bangladesh. It was. More than a dozen died, including a toddler swept away by mud and carried miles down the mountain slope to the sea. Schools closed and highways flooded, foreclosing the routes of emergency vehicles and making the community an inland island, as if behind a blockage choked off by a mud noose. Some climate cascades will unfold at the global level, cascades so large their effect will seem, by the curious legerdemain of environmental change, imperceptible. A warming planet leads to melting Arctic ice, which means less sunlight reflected back to the sun and more absorbed by a planet warming faster still, which means an ocean less able to absorb atmospheric carbon and so a planet warming faster still. A warming planet will also melt Arctic permafrost, which contains 1.8 trillion tons of carbon, more than twice as much as is currently suspended in the Earth's atmosphere, and some of which, when it thaws and is released, may evaporate as methane, which is 34 times as powerful a greenhouse gas warming blanket as carbon dioxide, when judged on the timescale of a century. When judged on the timescale of 2 decades, it is 86 times as powerful. A hotter planet is, on net, bad for plant life, which means what is called forest dieback, the decline and retreat of jungle basin as big as countries, and woods that sprawl for so many miles they used to contain whole forests, which means a dramatic stripping back of the planet's natural ability to absorb carbon and turn it into oxygen, which means still hotter temperatures, which means more dieback, and so on. Higher temperatures means more forest fires, means fewer trees, means less carbon absorption, means more carbon in the atmosphere, means a hotter planet still, and so on. A warmer planet means more water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor being a greenhouse gas. This brings higher temperatures still, and so on. Warmer oceans can absorb less heat, which means more stays in the air and contains less oxygen, which is doomed for phytoplankton, which does for the ocean what plants do on land, eating carbon and producing oxygen, which leaves us with more carbon, which heats the planet further, and so on. These are the systems climate scientists call feedbacks. There are more. Some work in the other directions, moderating climate change, but many more point towards an acceleration of warming should we trigger them. And just how these complicated, countervailing systems will interact, what effects will be exaggerated, and what undermined by feedbacks is unknown, which pulls a dark cloud of uncertainty over any effort to plan ahead for the climate future. We know what a best-case outcome climate change looks like, however unrealistic, because it quite closely resembles the world as we live on it today. But we have not yet begun to contemplate those cascades that may bring us to the infernal range of the bell curve. Other cascades are regional, collapsing on human communities and buckling them where they fall. These can be literal cascades. Human-triggered avalanches are on the rise, with 50,000 people killed by avalanches globally between 2004 and 2016. In Switzerland, climate change has unleashed a whole new kind, thanks to what are called rain-on-snow events, which also caused the overflow of the Oroville Dam in North California and the 2013 flood of Alberta, Canada, with damages approaching $5 billion. But there are other kinds of cascades too. Climate-driven water shortages or crop failures push climate refugees into nearby regions already struggling with resource scarcity. Sea level rise inundates cropland with more and more salt water flooding, transforming agricultural areas into brackish sponges, no longer able to adequately feed those living off them. Floating power plants, knocking regions offline just as electricity may be needed most, and crippling chemical and nuclear plants, which malfunctioning breathe out their toxic plumes. The rains that followed the campfire flooded the tent cities hastily assembled for the first disaster's refugees. In the case of the Santa Barbara mudslides, drought produced a state full of dry brush ripe for a spark. Then a year of anomalously monsoonist rain produced only more growth, and wildfires tore through the landscape, leaving a mountain slide without much plant life to hold in place the millions of tons of loose earth that make up the towering coastal range where the clouds stain together and the rain first falls. Some of those watching from afar wondered incredulously how a mudslide could kill so many. The answer is the same way as hurricanes or tornadoes, by weaponizing the environment, whether man-made or natural. Wind disasters do not kill by wind, however brutal it gets, but by tugging trees out of earth and transforming them into clubs, making power lines into loose beams and electrified nooses, collapsing homes on cowering residents, and turning cars into tumbling boulders. And they kill slowly too, by cutting off food delivery and medical supplies, making roads impassable even to first responders, knocking out phone lines and cell towers so that the ill and elderly must suffer and hope to endure in silence and without aid. Most of the world is not Santa Barbara, with its Mission-style impasto of infinite-seeming wealth, and in the coming decades, many of the most punishing climate horrors will indeed hit those least able to respond and recover. This is what is often called the problem of environmental justice. A sharper, less gauzy phrase would be climate caste system. The problem is acute within countries, even wealthy ones, where the poorest are those who live in the marshes, the swamps, the floodplains, the inadequately irrigated places with the most vulnerable infrastructure. Altogether an unwitting environmental apartheid. Just in Texas, 500,000 poor Latinos live in shanty towns called colonias with no drainage system to deal with increased flooding. The cleavage is even sharper globally, where the poorest countries will suffer more in our hot new world. In fact, with one exception, Australia, countries with lower GDPs will warm the most. This is notwithstanding the fact that much of the global south has not, to this point, defiled the atmosphere of the planet all that much. This is one of the many historical ironies of climate change that would better be called cruelties. So merciless is the suffering they will inflict. But disproportionately, as it will fall on the world's list, the devastation of global warming cannot be easily quarantined in the developing world, as much as those in the northern hemisphere would probably, and not to our credit, prefer it. Climate disaster is too indiscriminate for that. In fact, the belief that climate could be possibly governed or managed by any institution or human instrument presently at hand is another wide-eyed climate delusion. The planet survived many millennia without anything approaching a world government. In fact, endured nearly the entire span of human civilization that way, organized into competitive tribes and fiefdoms and kingdoms and nation-states, and only began to build something resembling a cooperative blueprint very piecemeal after brutal world wars in the form of the League of the Nations and United Nations and European Union and even the market fabric of globalization. Whatever its flaws, still a vision of cross-national participation imbued with the neoliberal ethos that life on Earth was a positive sum game. If you had to invent a trade grand enough and global enough to plausibly conjure into being a system of true international cooperation, climate change would be it. The threat everywhere and overwhelming and total. And yet now, just as the need for that kind of cooperation is paramount, indeed necessary for anything like the world we live to survive, we are only unbuilding those alliances, recoiling into nationalistic corners, and retreating from collective responsibility and from each other. That collapse of trust is a cascade too. Just how completely the world below our feet will become unknown to us is not yet clear, and how we register its transformation remains an open question. One legacy of the environmentalist creed that long prized the natural world as a otherworldly retreat is that we see its degradation as a sequestered story, unfolding separately from our own modern lives, so separately that the degradation acquires the comfortable contours of parable, like pages from Aesop, aestheticized even when we know the losses as tragedy. Climate change could soon mean that, in the fall, trees may simply turn brown, and so we will look differently at entire schools of painting, which stretched for generations, devoted to best capturing the oranges and reds. We can no longer see ourselves out of the windows of our cars as we drive along our highways. The coffee plants of Latin America will no longer produce fruit. Beach homes will be built on higher and higher stilts and still be drowned. In many cases, it is better to use the present tense. In just the last 40 years, according to the World Wildlife Fund, more than half of the world's vertebrate animals have died. In just the last 25, one study of German nature preserves found the flying insect population declined by 3/4. The delicate dance of flowers and their pollinators has been disrupted, as have the migration patterns of goat, which have fled up the eastern seaboard towards the Arctic, invading the communities of fishermen that fed on them for centuries, as have the hibernation patterns of black bears, many of which now stay awake all winter. Species individuated over millions of years of evolution but forced together by climate change have begun to mate with one another for the first time, producing a whole new class of hybrid species, the grizzly bear, the coy wolf. The zoos are already natural history museums, the children's book already out of date. Older fables too will be remade. The story of Atlantis, having endured and enchanted for several millennia, will compete with the real-time sagas of the Marshall Islands and Miami Beach, each sinking over time into snorkelers' paradises. The strange fantasy of Santa and his polar workshop will grow eerier still in an Arctic of ice-free summers, and there is a terrible poignancy in complementing how desertification of the entire Mediterranean basin will change our reading of the Odyssey, or how it will discolor the sign of Greek islands for dust from the Sahara to permanently blanket their skies, or how it will recast the meaning of the pyramids for the Nile to be dramatically drained. We will think of the border with Mexico differently. Presumably, when the Rio Grande is a line traced through a dry riverbed, the Rio Sand is already been called. The imperious West has spent 5 centuries looking down its nose at the plight of those living within the pale of tropical disease, and one wonders how that will change when mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue are flying through the streets of Copenhagen and Chicago too. But we have for so long understood stories about nature as allegories that we seem unable to recognize that the meaning of climate change is not sequestered in parable. It encompasses us in a very real way. It governs us, our crop yields, our pandemics, our migration patterns and civil wars, crime waves and domestic assaults, hurricanes and heat waves, and rain bombs and mega droughts, the shape of our economic growth, and everything that flows downstream from it, which today means nearly everything. 800 million in South Asia alone, the World Bank says, would see their living conditions sharply diminished by 2050 on the current emissions track, and perhaps a climate slowdown will even reveal the bounty of what Andreas Malm calls fossil capitalism to be an illusion, sustained over just a few centuries by the arithmetic of adding the energy value of burnt fossil fuels to what had been before wood and coal and oil, an eternal Malthusian trap. In which case, we would have to retire the intuition that history will inevitably extract material progress from the planet, at least in any reliable or global pattern, and come to terms somehow with just how pervasively that intuition ruled even our inner lives, often tyrannically. Adaptation to climate change is often viewed in terms of market trade-offs, but in the coming decades the trade will work in the opposite direction, with relative prosperity or benefit of more aggressive action. Every degree of warming it's been estimated, cost a temperate country like the United States about 1 percentage point of GDP. And according to one recent paper, at 1.5 degrees, the world would be $20 trillion richer than at 2 degrees. Turn the dial of another degree or two, and the cost balloon, the compound interest of environmental catastrophe. 3.7 degrees of warming would produce $551 trillion in damages. Research suggests total worldwide wealth is today about $280 trillion. Our current emissions trajectory takes us over 4 degrees by 2100. Multiply that by that 1% of GDP, and you have almost entirely wiped out the very possibility of economic growth, which has not topped 5% globally in over 40 years. A French group of alarmed academics call this prospect steady-state economics, but it ultimately suggests a more complete retreat from economics as an orienting beacon, and from growth as the lingua franca through which modern life launders all of its aspirations. Steady state also gives a name to the creeping panic that history may be less progressive, as we have come to believe, really only over the last several centuries, than cyclical, as we were sure it was for the many millennia before. More than that, in the vision steady-state economics projects of a state of nature competitive scramble, everything from politics to trade and war seems brutally zero-sum. For centuries, we have looked to nature as a mirror onto which to first project, then observe ourselves. But what is the moral? There is nothing to learn from global warming because we do not have the time or the distance to contemplate its lesson. We are, after all, not merely telling the story but living it. There is trying to. The threat is immense. How immense? One 2018 paper sketches the math in horrifying detail. In the journal Nature Climate Change, a team led by Drew Sindel tried to quantify the suffering that would be avoided if warming was kept to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees. In other words, how much additional suffering would result from just that additional half degree of warming. Their answer, 150 million more people would die from air pollution alone in a 2-degree warmer world than in a 1.5 degree warmer one. Later that year, the IPCC raised the stakes further. In the gap between 1.5 degrees and 2, it said hundreds of millions of lives were at stake. Numbers that large can be hard to grasp, but 150 million is the equivalent of 25 Holocausts. It is 3 times the size of the death toll of the Great Leap Forward, the largest non-military death toll humanity has ever produced. It is more than twice the greatest death toll of any kind, World War II. The numbers don't begin to climb only when we hit 1.5 degrees, of course, as should not surprise you. They are already accumulating at a rate of at least 7 million deaths from air pollution alone each year, an annual holocaust pursued and prosecuted by what brand of nihilism? This is what is meant when climate change is called an existential crisis, a drama we are now haphazardly improvising between 2 hellish poles, in which our base case outcome is death and suffering at the scale of 25 Holocausts, and the worst case outcome puts us on the brink of extinction. Rhetoric often fails us on climate because the only factually appropriate language is of a kind we have been trained by a buoyant culture of a sunny side of optimism to dismiss categorically as hyperbole. Here, the facts are hysterical, and the dimensions of the drama that will play out between those poles incomprehensibly large enough to enclose not just all of present-day humanity, but all of our possible futures as well. Global warming has improbably compressed into 2 generations the entire story of human civilization. First, the project of remaking the planet so that it is undeniably ours, a project whose exhaust, the poison of emissions, now casually works its way through millennia of ice so quickly you can see them melt with the naked eye, destroying the environmental conditions that have held stable and steadily governed for literally all of human history. That has been the work of a single generation. The second generation faces a very different task, the project of preserving our collective future, forestalling that devastation and engineering an alternate path. There is simply no analogy to draw on outside of mythology and theology, and perhaps the Cold War prospect of mutually assured destruction. Few feel like gods in the face of warming, but that the totality of climate change should make us feel so passive, that is another of his delusions. In folklore and comic books and church pews and movie trailers, stories about the fate of the earth often perversely counsel passivity in their audiences, and perhaps it should not surprise us that the threat of climate change is no different. By the end of the Cold War, the prospect of nuclear winter had clouded every corner of our pop culture and psychology, a pervasive nightmare that the human experiment might be brought to an end by two jousting set of proud, rivalrous tacticians, just a few sets of twitchy hands hovering over the planet's self-destruct buttons. The threat of climate change is more dramatic still, and ultimately more democratic, with responsibility shared by each of us even as we shiver in fear of it. And yet, we have processed that threat only in parts, typically not concretely or explicitly, displacing certain anxieties and inventing others, choosing to ignore the bleakest features of our possible future and letting our political fatalism and technological fate blur, or as though we had gone cross-eyed into a remarkably familiar consumer fantasy that someone else will fix the problem for us at no cost. Those more panicked are often hardly less complacent, living instead through climate fatalism as though it were climate optimism. Over the last few years, as the planet's own environmental rhythms have seemed to grow more fatalistic, skeptics have found themselves arguing not that climate change isn't happening, since extreme weather has made that undeniable, but that its causes are unclear, suggesting that the changes we are seeing are the result of natural cycles rather than human activities and interventions. It is a very strange argument. If the planet is warming at a terrifying pace and on a horrifying scale, it should transparently concern us more rather than less that the warming is beyond our control, possibly even our comprehension. That we know global warming is our doing should be a comfort, not a cause for despair. However incomprehensibly large and complicated we find the processes that we have brought it into being. That we know we are, ourselves, responsible for all of its punishing effects should be empowering, and not just perversely. Global warming is, after all, a human invention, and the flip side of our real-time guilt is that we remain in command. No matter how out of control the climate system seems, with its rolling typhoons, unprecedented famines and heat waves, refugee crises and climate conflicts, we are all its authors, and still writing. Some, like our oil companies and their political patrons, are more prolific authors than others. But the burden of responsibility is too great to be shouldered by a few. However comforting it is to think all that is needed is for a few villains to fall. Each of us imposes some suffering on our future selves every time we flip on a light switch, buy a plane ticket, or fail to vote. Now we all share the responsibility to write the next act. We found a way to engineer devastation, and we can find a way to engineer our way out of it. Or, rather, engineer our way towards a degraded model, but one that nevertheless extends towards a promise of new generations finding their own way forward, perhaps toward a more brighter environmental future. Since I first began writing about warming, I have often been asked whether I see any reason for optimism. The thing is, I am optimistic. Given the prospect that humans could engineer a climate that is 6 or even 8 degrees warmer over the course of the next several centuries, large swathes of the planet, unlivable by any definition we use today, that degraded model counts for me as an encouraging future. Warming of 3 or 3.5 degrees would unleash suffering beyond anything that humans have ever experienced through many millennia of strain and strife and all-out war. But it is not a fatalistic scenario. In fact, it is a whole lot better than where we are headed. And in the form of carbon capture technology, we should extract CO2 from the air, or geoengineering, we should cool the planet by suspending gas in the atmosphere, or other now unfathomable innovations, we may conjure new solutions which could bring the planet closer to a state we would today regard as merely grim rather than apocalyptic. I have also often been asked whether it's moral to reproduce in this climate, whether it's responsible to have children, whether it's fair to the planet, or perhaps more important to the children. As it happens, in the course of writing this book, I did have a child, Roka. Part of that choice was delusion, that same willful blindness. I know there are climate horrors to come, some of which will inevitably be visited on my children. That is what it means for warming to be all-encompassing, all-touching threat. But those horrors are not yet scripted. We are staging them by inaction, and by action can stop them. Climate change means some bleak prospects for the decades ahead, but I don't believe the appropriate response to that challenge is withdrawal, is surrender. I think you have to do everything you can to make the world accommodate dignified and flourishing life, rather than giving up early, before the fight has been lost or won, and acclimating yourself to a dreary future brought into being by others less concerned about climate pain. The fight is definitely not yet lost. In fact, will never be lost, so long as we avoid extinction, because, however warm the planet gets, it will always be the case that the decade that follows could contain more suffering or less. And I have to admit, I am also excited for everything that Roka and her sisters and brothers will see, will witness, will do. She will hit her child-rearing years around 2050. When we could have climate refugees in the many tens of millions. She will be entering old age at the close of the century, the end-stage bookmark on all of our projections for warming. In between, she will watch the world doing battle with a genuinely existential threat and the people of her generation making a future for themselves and the generations they bring into being on this planet. And she won't just be watching it, she will be living it, quite literally, the greatest story ever told. It may well bring a happy ending. What cause is there for hope? Carbon hangs in the air for decades, with some of the most terrifying feedbacks unspooling over even longer time horizons, which keeps warming the eerie simmer of an unending menace. But the climate change is not an ancient crime we are tasked with solving now. We are destroying our planet every day, often with one hand as we conspire to restore it with the other. Which means, as Paul Hawken has perhaps illustrated most cool-headedly, we can also stop destroying it, in the same style collectively, haphazardly, in all the most quotidian ways, in addition to the spectacular seeming ones. The project of unplugging the entire industrial world from fossil fuels is intimidating, and must be done in fairly short order by 2040, many scientists say. But in the meantime, many avenues are open, wide open, if we are not too lazy and too blinkered and too selfish to embark upon them. Fully half of British emissions, it was recently calculated, come from inefficiencies in constructions, disregarded and unused food, electronics and clothing. 2/3 of American energy is wasted. Globally, according to one paper, we are subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5 trillion each year. None of that has to continue. Slow walking action on climate, another paper found, will cost the world $26 trillion by just 2030. That does not have to continue. Americans waste a quarter of their food, which means that the carbon footprint of the average meal is a third larger than it has to be. That need not continue. 5 years ago, hardly anyone outside the darkest corner of the internet had even heard of Bitcoin. Today, mining it consumes more electricity than is generated by all the world's solar panels combined, which means that in just a few years we have assembled, out of distrust of one another and the nations behind fiat currencies, a program to wipe out the gains of several long, hard generations of green energy innovation. It did not have to be that way, and a simple change to the algorithm could eliminate that Bitcoin footprint entirely. These are just a few of the reasons to believe that what the Canadian activist Stuart Parker has called climate nihilism is, in fact, another of our delusions. What happens from here will be entirely on our doing. The planet's future will be determined in large part by the arc of growth in the developing world. That's where most of the people are, in China and India, and increasingly sub-Saharan Africa. But this is no absolution for the West, where the average citizen produces many times more emissions than almost anyone in Asia, just out of habit. I toss out tons of wasted food and hardly ever recycle. I leave my air conditioning on. I bought in Bitcoin at the peak of the market. None of that is necessary either. But it is also isn't necessary for the Westerners to adopt the lifestyle of the global poor. 70% of the energy produced by the planet, it's estimated, is lost as waste heat. If the average American were confined by the carbon footprint of her European counterpart, US carbon emissions would fall by more than half. If the world's richest 10% were limited to that same footprint, global emissions would fall by a third. And why shouldn't they be? Almost as a prophylactic against climate guilt, as the news from science has grown bleaker, Western liberals have comforted themselves by contorting their own consumption patterns into performance of moral or environmental purity. Less beef, more Teslas, fewer transatlantic flights. But the climate calculus is such that individual lifestyle choices do not add up to much, unless they are scaled by politics. America's rump climate party aside, that scaling should not be impossible once we understand the stakes. In fact, the stakes mean it must not be. Annihilation is only the very thin tail of warming's very long bell curve, and there is nothing stopping us from steering clear of it. But what lies between us and extinction is horrifying enough, and we have not yet begun to contemplate what it means to live under those conditions, what it will do to our politics and our culture and our emotional equilibria, our sense of history and our relationship to it, our sense of nature and our relationship to it, that we are living in a world degraded by our own hands, with the horizon of human possibility dramatically dimmed. We may yet see a climate deus ex machina, or rather, we may yet build one in the form of carbon capture technology or geoengineering, or in the form of a revolution in the way we generate power, electric or political. But that solution, if it comes at all, will emerge against a bleak horizon, darkened by our emissions as if by glaucoma. Especially those who have imbibed several centuries of Western triumphalism tend to see the story of human civilization as an inevitable conquest of the earth, rather than the saga of an insecure culture like mold growing haphazardly and unsurely upon it. That fragility, which pervades now everything humans might do on this planet, is the great existential insight of global warming. But it is only beginning to shake our triumphalism, though. If we had stopped to contemplate the possibilities a generation ago, it probably would not surprise us to see a new form of political nihilism emerging in the region of the world already baked hardest by global warming, the Middle East, and expressed there through suicidal spasm of theoretical violence. That region was once called, grandly, the cradle of civilization. Today, political nihilism radiates almost everywhere, through the many cultures that arose, branching from Middle Eastern roots. We have all already left behind the narrow window of environmental conditions that allowed the human animal to evolve in the first place. But not just evolve, that window has enclosed everything we remember as history, and value as progress, and study as politics. What will it mean to live outside that window, probably quite far outside it? That reckoning is the subject of this book. None of it is news. The science that makes up the following 12 chapters has been called from interviews with dozens of experts and from hundreds of papers published in the best academic journals over the previous decades or so. Since it is science, it is tentative, ever evolving, and some of the predictions that follow will surely not come precisely to pass. But it is an honest and fair portrait of the state of our collective understanding of many multiplying traits that our warming planet poses to all of us presently living on it, and hoping we may continue to do so in an infinite and undisturbed way. Little of it is about nature per se, and none concerns the tragic fate of the planet's animals, which has been written about so elegantly and poetically by others that, like our sea level myopia, it threatens to occlude our picture of what global warming means for us, the human animal. Until now, it seems to have been easier for us to empathize with the climate plight of other species than our own, perhaps because we have such a hard time acknowledging or understanding our own responsibility and complicity in the changes now unfolding, and such an easier time evaluating the morally simpler calculus of pure victimhood. What follows is instead a kaleidoscopic accounting of the human cost of human life continuing as it has for a generation, which will fill up the planet with only more humans what ongoing global warming spells for public health, for conflict, for politics, and food production, and pop culture, for urban life and mental health, and the way we imagine our own futures as we begin to perceive all around us, an acceleration of history, and the diminishing of possibility that acceleration likely brings. The force of retribution will cascade down to us through nature, but the cost to nature is only one part of the story. We will all be hurting. I may be in the minority in feeling that the world could lose much of what we think of as nature as far as I cared, so long as we could go on living as we have in the world left behind. The problem is we can't.